Welcome to Lecture 4 of Mysticism and Psychedelics. I'm going to be reading a lot from this lecture, and I'll provide you the script. It's also quite a bit of this lecture is from a book that I published with Palgrave Macmillan in 2019 titled A Transatlantic Political Theology of Psychedelic Aesthetics, which I know is a wordy book title, but book publishers want authors these days to title what used to be the subtitle with all of the words that would be search terms in Google. So I didn't intentionally, it was supposed to just be called Enchanted Citizens and then all of that other stuff. But just Enchanted Citizens doesn't tell you what the rest of the book is about, I suppose. I will, because I don't assume that all of you who are watching have read all of the things that I've read, I'll pause and do some fill in the blank as well. And so this might take this lecture and another lecture as well. But I'll dig in here. The lecture today is on Soma and the idea of Soma. And if you are following the reading list for this class, the book that we are reading to accompany this is called Persephone's Quest by R. Gordon Wasson and other scholars. And many people will already know that R. Gordon Wasson is famous for basically bringing the magic mushroom to the mass consciousness, the term magic mushrooms, from a Life magazine article in about 1957. And it was through him visiting this Mazatec woman who worked with mushrooms named Maria Sabina that it kind of exploded psychedelic mushrooms into sort of mainstream American society, and it caused all sorts of tourism and lots of youth culture sort of going down to Mexico, famous people wanting to be around and have Maria Sabina give them mushrooms and all sorts of that, so you can still go down to Mexico today. I'm not going to talk a whole bunch about Sabina today, but that's why R. Gordon Wasson is so important. And if you've been reading the book Persephone's Quest, you'll notice that right from the beginning, he pretty much asserts that he thinks that mushrooms, a different mushroom, not psilocybin mushrooms, but Amanita muscaria mushrooms, are the substance of Soma from the Rig Veda, which, of course, are ancient texts from India, about 3,000-ish years old. Lots to be said about that. Just remember that in the ways that I've been teaching this course, the concept of Hinduism, the concept of Buddhism, these are the isms on those ends of those concepts come from 19th century comparative religion. And so we, at least in the West, we Euro-Christians, as I often say, which has nothing to do with our faith, right? It's just a social movement and a cultural backdrop. We only inherit access to those isms through the colonialist gaze, the colonialist projects of the 19th century. So I tend to be kind of arm's length, even though I know very well that in broader popular culture, we often talk about the big five religions, right? Like Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, right? That kind of concept about religion comes out of also comparative religions in the late 19th century, and especially in the 1950s when a bunch of this is coming out. There was a book called The Religions of Man by Houston Smith, who was a big proponent for psychedelics as well. And so that again came out of a specific field that we now call comparative religion. And there have been critiques within religious studies of that, and I'll get to that as we pass. So if you haven't had much background in religious studies, you'll get a little bit more of that, of course, as always in this course. So yes, R. Gordon Wasson and his wife, Valentina Pavlovna, I believe is her name, and a number of scholars, all doing this kind of philological work. And that's like philology is the study of language, right? It just means the love of language, but so tracing word histories and cognates of words to find earlier concepts of so ancient languages, like the what language descends from another language, right? Family trees and linguistics terms. So they're quite different in terms of their methodologies than the people that we've been reading so far, like Nick Longlitz or William Richards, who are definitely dealing with more of the science lab type of engagement with brain science and the decade of the brain and that stuff. So we're taking quite a big turn here, and we're going to be addressing a lot of these issues around ancient religion that seem to hover around psychedelic discourse. So let me just dig in here, and I'll kind of explain as we go along. And if this lecture gets really long, I'll pause and start another lecture. In the Rig Veda, Soma appears to have multiple meanings. So remember, Wasson thinks that Soma is Amanita muscaria, the mushroom. In an article titled On the Significance of Soma, Sanskrit scholar Biswanath Mukhopadhyay historicized the development of the term Soma as follows. Quote, Soma first means the inebriating juice of plants. Secondly, the plants bearing Soma. Thirdly, the elixir of life and delight. And lastly, the god Soma. So there are different meanings to that word Soma, even in the Sanskrit. But Mukhopadhyay believes that there's a kind of historical trajectory in how the meanings develop over time. He also mentions that it's derived from the Proto-Indo-European root su, like su, right, meaning to press. Soma in the Vedas is also related to songs, so not just in the Rig Veda, but the Sama Veda. There are other Vedas, right? So Soma in the Vedas is also related to music, along with the deities Agni and Savitur, and it is particularly associated with the Anastub meter and the creation of the sacrifice from the Rig Veda. And that's at Rig Veda 10.1 and 130, if you need that. And in a related article on the Bhagavad Gita, Mukhopadhyay discusses the distinction between divine and mortal Soma. Quote, it is through the power and the inspiration of this drink alone that the victorious god Indra accepted the task of killing the fearful demon Vritra. Soma is also associated with Sri Krishna's celestial singing in the Sama Veda, dating as far back as 1700 BCE. Soma persists through later Indian literature. And so in the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of this massive well, not just text, but a massive kind of collection of stories and epic, the Mahabharata. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna, the kind of main hero of the Bhagavad Gita, that Krishna is Arjuna himself. So Soma, in this sense, appears to be something like the entheogen par excellence, just because it's so old in terms of human culture, and we get it documented being used in this sacrifice story. And there's a lot to be said, and there's a lot to be guessed about, and a lot of assumptions people make about the ancient world, which we can get to. But we do know, just at a very sort of practical level, like, yes, there is this substance this substance called Soma. It is in these ancient texts. The texts were being recited and performed orally, and they still are today in much of India, and depending on the ways that you recite it, according to my Sanskrit scholar colleagues, it can mean different things. So I want just to be very, very careful for those of us as scholars about, the tendency to want to locate something as one particular thing. And you can already see that I have take some issue with R. Gordon Wasson, as do others. So just to let people know, R. Gordon Wasson is very sure in this book, Persephone's Quest, that he writes at the end of his life, that he has found Soma. And, it's more than, 35 years later, and scholars still debate. Nobody really knows what Soma was. But some scholars will say that this is what they think that it is, and then they can fight, as scholars often do. The ancient meaning of Soma must, at least according to me here, be linked to the part that it plays as oblation in the sacrifice, a unifying aspect of the mortal and the divine. Thomas Oberle argues, quote, access to the divine draft Soma signifies political power and legitimizes rule. Those who took the Soma became a political elite. Jared Whittaker, however, disagrees with Oberle's assertion that the terms presser, or susvi, or non-presser, asusvi, represent a separation of Vedic society into two halves, one that participates in the Soma cult and one that's excluded from it. And we don't know, I just like to throw that in just to let you know that we debate as scholars. Like, it's hard to really determine, even from texts, what social life was exactly like. It's a kind of difference between cultural anthropology on the one hand and physical anthropology that studies just archaeology and artifacts, right? When we have to make guesses about what people did and how they behaved, and what their worldview was, and all sorts of things like that become really difficult for those of us who study the ancient world. So in either case, despite this kind of debate about who took the Soma, it does appear that access to Soma was meant for those who were privileged in some way, and that those who were non-pressers were looked down upon for not participating in the cult. While it's unclear to what extent Soma pressing determined citizenship, it is in something like a state, or it's not really a state, but certainly not in the modern sense, but in a group that identifies itself as such, whether it's Brahmin or what people call Aryan, not, of course, the National Socialist version of Aryan, but an ancient version of that. So it's unclear to what extent Soma pressing determined citizenship. It's certainly a term that distinguished an identity group, even if that was only a group of priests. So partaking in the sacrifice determines the inclusion in this cosmology of the group. If Mukhopadhyay is right in relating Soma to the relationship between Krishna and Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, the conception of the divine inspiration and the conception of divine inspiration and merge transcend, or that merging that happens when you're inspired, transcends the sacrificial ritual and eventually relates to this concept of dharma, or upholding a kind of natural order of things. So if ingested, Soma appears to inspire one to act correctly. And acting rightly, one performs a kind of citizenship in the Soma cult. It's not the citizen in the way that people like Thomas Hobbes or early modern political philosophers were thinking about it, but it does give somebody a kind of status within an existing kind of group, is what it appears to be doing in the ancient texts. So to press and drink soma was part of also the ritual sacrifice. And if you read the Rig Veda, that's really what's going on over and over again. It's kind of the text that deals with the sacrifice. So writers enthusiastic about psychedelics often gloss Soma's travels from India into ancient Greece, where the ancient word's meaning changed to represent body. So when we say psychosomatic today, right, that word, the mental thoughts affecting our body, right? The body is Soma there. So it still comes from that older root language of Proto-Indo-European, of which both Greek and Sanskrit are family members with the different branches from the earlier tree of Proto-Indo-European. But there seems to be a more specific tangible body notion of Soma in the Greek. So right, just to come back here, writers enthusiastic about psychedelics gloss Soma's travels from India to ancient Greece, where the ancient word's meaning changed to represent body. Many scholars quickly point to the Eleusinian mysteries. Hasty references to the mysteries, such as Wasson's famous claims in the 1950s, cited by Leary in his perennial returns to the pre-political, mask, for me, a liberal universalizing political theology. And so what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that, so first of all, Leary, already in the 1950s, takes Wasson's ideas and runs with them, especially references to Eleusinian mysteries. And Leary is already in the 1960s sort of theorizing that through taking psychedelics, we can get back to this earlier state, an archaic revival, as I sometimes refer to it, to something like, like neo-shamanic people who are interested in neo-shamanism often sort of figured how they think of what so-called shamanism is, which of course is an extracted term from the Tungus people in Siberia that through colonialism in Russia first later entered sort of anthropological discourse, and so it has become this kind of universalized concept that gets applied to groups in South America or groups all over, much to the dismay of individual indigenous groups often. So the term shaman is problematic. But in neo-shamanic thought, there's a lot of emphasis on the idea that we could somehow get back, maybe through psychedelics, maybe through certain kinds of festivals. Burning Man kind of does this thing, that we could get back to an earlier kind of religion before religion, right? And religious studies scholars will take a lot of issues with that kind of conception. Not that the conception isn't fascinating and worth studying and thinking about, but the claims to have that kind of direct access to the archaic past are something that a lot of researchers in the field, especially myself, will take issue with for various reasons that I will get to. So that's that kind of liberal universalizing political theology. It's almost like liberalism, not in the sense of Democrat, right, or versus Republican, but liberalism in the sense of a rights-based subject, a political system based on rights-based individuals. And because you're an individual, you might believe in a particular religion, right? And so we are so informed by our Euro-Christian culture in the United States, especially from Protestant Euro-Christian culture, which tends to emphasize a kind of personal relationship with a deity. That personal relationship is also reflected in our rights-based systems and our politics. And so that's why Euro-Christian is, as a lowercase one word, is the terminology that I use as a social movement and not as a religion that is something that people believe in or not, because that conception of religion as a belief system is already inflected too much by Euro-Christian thought, and it doesn't really speak to the ways that people practice traditional things that we might call religion around the world. Heady stuff, I know. So let me keep on going here. So Leary was intrigued by Wasson. Wasson was like attaching this stuff to the Eleusinian mysteries early on. In the 1960s, he goes to India, right, and he starts trying to find um, uh, the quest for Soma there. In linguistics terms, it's tough to track Soma from directly, like from Sanskrit into Greek, or from Proto-Indo-European into Greek. But mid 20th century scholars like John M. Allegro, who was one of the original members of the Dead Sea Scrolls research team, who wrote a controversial book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross around 1970, I think it came out. Allegro claimed that that there are psychedelic roots to Christianity, and he made this claim by employing a philological comparative method, right? So he's comparing roots of words, and that's where some of this stuff gets really crazy sounding for us if we don't know the ancient languages. So we'll see as I read down here. So such methods, just the comparative philological methods, oftentimes, like today, appear outdated to contemporary scholars because the methods closely align with a Eurocentrism or Euro-Christian disposition from the 19th century or 19th century comparative religion. Philological methods persist uncritically in all sorts of literature on psychedelics, especially that tracing the meaning of Soma. So while some anthropological evidence is emergent in diaspora studies, Soma can only be roughly traced both through mythology, etymology or the word history, and philosophy. So while I'm not at all claiming the accuracy of such an approach, I will employ it here today in this lecture to help describe the logic of how people who are enthusiastic about psychedelics often express both their entrenchment in the European imaginary and the inherent liberalism within psychedelic political perspectives. So remember, my approach to psychedelics is a discourse analysis approach. And the reason why that approach is important is because, as we've seen in this class from reading Ann Taves early on in our first week, from reading Huxley, and from reading people like Nick Longlitz now and William Richards, what we've seen especially is that there is new research that we have access to in 2022 that come from brain research as to what the brains do. So not Raphael Millier, Carhart Harris, for example, one of the researchers we've looked at, notes that actually, this idea that consciousness, that our brains are a reducing valve, which comes from Henry Bergson and Aldous Huxley, have this kind of notion of consciousness. What we've seen more and more from recent brain science is that consciousness appears to be constructed from within, from our neural pathways within our brains. So rather than maybe just being a reducing valve, it might be generating something itself with the neural pathways in our brains. And so what you have are these kind of two competing conceptions of what consciousness is within the psychedelics world. So like people who are into hallucinogen research still take that kind of like consciousness as a reduction, the mind at large, which is what Huxley calls it. And that we somehow tap into that mind at large. But what Carhart Harris and some of the folks in England who've been studying brains have been seeing is that it's actually what happens is like we get some of our most sort of close to mystical states when most of the rest of our brain is shut off and there's only like a couple of isolated areas. So it's about kind of shutting down, and we get with that shutting down, there's this kind of expansive state. And there might be ways to reconcile those views, but I just want to make sure that tension is there because current brain science is, we just know so much more about the brain now than maybe people did 60 years ago. So the scholarly literature on Soma codes the desires, from my perspective, of the scholars working in the field. Discourse analysis, right? The desires that drive us as scholars. Doesn't mean that pointing it out means that they're just necessarily bad all the time, but it's something to think about. What motivates us, as we say in rhetoric. So, for example, in The Apples of Apollo, this other book, Pagan Mysteries of the Eucharist by Carl A.P. Ruck, who's also an author of Persephone's Quest, and this is the guy who coins the term entheogen in the late 70s, or a God-infused substance that sometimes gets applied to psychedelics. So this book, The Apples of Apollo by Carl A.P. Ruck, Blaise Daniel Staples, and Clark Heinrich these authors discuss Soma by focusing on entheogens, particularly the hallucinogenic mushroom Amanita muscaria, which they trace from its usage in the Rig Veda through the Indo-Aryan and Indo-European nomadic cultures, which transported both entheogens and ideas about sacrifice into ancient Greece. Ruck and his colleagues discuss the myth of Perseus, the Greek myth, or as the mushroom picker. They read what other scholars have read as a kind of tiny detail, which is Perseus's picking of a mushroom on the side of a mountain on the site of the city of Mycenae, as the culmination of his entire career. For plucking the mushroom and decapitating Medusa appear to these scholars as being one and the same. And so you would have to do some Greek language work to see like what they're really saying, that like picking a mushroom or plucking the mushroom's head has this, it's a code for also cutting off Medusa's head, right? Or that gesture is the same thing as picking a mushroom. And of course, Medusa has, turns people to stone, and so there's something quite dangerous about getting access to her. So they base their findings on analyses of language, but also depictions of Greek vase from the 4th century BC. Moreover, they note that in the garden of the Hesperid sisters, Medusa's head, quote, is equated to the golden apples of the tree, and with a pair of mushrooms. This group of scholars then has a long history of trying to identify Amanita muscaria as Soma. Ruck and his colleagues base much of their research on the ethnobotanical work of R. Gordon Wasson, the famous banker turned ethnomycologist, whose article Seeking the Magic Mushroom brought the subject to a wide public in the late 1950s. Wasson's article influenced many scholars and hipsters to hallucinogenic mushrooms and brought traditional healers such as Maria Sabina, into the public eye. Sabina's aesthetic influence on the psychedelic poets like Anne Waldman, who's a friend of mine, is evident in Jerome Rothenberg's collection, a book called Maria Sabina Selections, which is just a nice collection if you're wanting to do more research on Sabina herself. Wasson's research eventually led him from Mexico to India and Southeast Asia during the 1960s. He believed he could prove the Soma plant was a mushroom. In 1969, Wasson published a book called Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. Like Allegro's thesis, Wasson's work did not go unchallenged due to a lack of the mushrooms in present-day India. Even so, in an article titled Historical Evidence, India's Sacred Soma, from 1972 by Houston Smith, remember that guy who wrote The Religions of Man, or The World's Religions? It had a couple of different titles, but it was a very famous book. Smith defends the validity of R. Gordon Wasson's claim to have identified the Soma plant as a hallucinogenic mushroom against those who deemed Wasson an amateur, citing the approval of a variety of scholars, including Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roman Jakobson. And so Jakobson is a really important linguist from the 20th century. Lévi-Strauss, of course, is a really important anthropologist from the 20th century. And these are people who, along with Houston Smith, tended to align with Wasson. And so it's important because they're really well-known scholars in the field, and so they get around the fact that Wasson was considered an amateur researcher by some. I mean, he also spent a lot of time studying mushrooms, so he knew quite a bit of stuff. But it is through, at least in religious studies and stuff, it's through people like Huston Smith who accept Wasson's claims that we get a lot more of this kind of universalized sense of Soma that nowadays people who are more well-versed in Sanskrit study might challenge that, right? So because his books were had such a big impact on popular culture and how we think about religion in the United States, people tend to come with assumptions already about these types of things that current scholarship can maybe it needs to do some correcting on. So Wasson's 1986 collaboration with Stella Cramrich, Jonathan Ott, and A.P. Ruck, Persephone's Quest, Entheogens and Origins of Religion, which I've assigned for this class. If you're reading it, you don't have to be reading it, but that's the book that aligns with this lecture. Persephone's Quest mentions that entheogens, quote, are extraordinarily rare in the Eurasian botanical world, and Amanita muscaria was, they say, the entheogen of the ancient world. The citations of Soma and the Rig Veda are all consistent. This is all, I'm quoting them, right? They say the citations of Soma and the Rig Veda are all consistent with this reading. Wasson then sees challenges to his theory when somebody doesn't believe him. He says that what people are doing is, this is just evidence of their Eurocentric aversion to mushrooms. And he's so sure of this by 1986 that he claims, quote, we are well beyond the stage of hypotheses. It's unclear at this point if Wasson is referring to just Amanita muscaria or if he's referring to the thesis that he and his wife had first developed about cultural attitudes towards plant life. But he does seem like overall, as you read Persephone's Quest, you get the sense it's like he's dang sure that he thinks that it's Amanita muscaria. And that's just gone, it has not gone unchallenged even since he wrote that book. So in any case, a large body of literature now surrounds Wasson and his intellectual peers like Carl Ruck and Huston Smith and Jonathan Ott and Albert Hofmann. And this group of intellectuals, beginning in the late 50s and continuing today, have made a large impact on both religious studies and broader culture. So controversy continues today. Wasson and Allegro also disagreed about specific aspects of mushrooms influencing Christianity, as J.R. Irvin has explored. Yet writers such as James Arthur or John A. Rush continue to situate mushrooms as central to human civilization itself. So those books, just to let you know, J.R. Irvin's book is The Holy Mushroom, Evidence of Mushrooms in Judeo-Christianity from Gnostic Media in 2008. James Arthur, Mushrooms and Mankind. John A. Rush, who's the editor of a big volume called Entheogens and the Development of Culture. So there's a lot of books out there that kind of take these ideas and run with them. That Huston Smith chose to reprint in 2000 his 1972 article defending Wasson in his self-selected anthology of his own work, Cleansing the Doors of Perception, attests to Smith's acceptance of Wasson's claim, despite the numerous other hypotheses about the nature of the original Soma plant. It's now, for example, generally understood that Soma was not a single plant, and as far back as 1978, Mukhopadhyay has asserted this. So Soma in ethnobotanic and religious discourse since the late 50s has broadened in meaning as it has joined a larger discussion about entheogens in general and their relationship to human civilization. And this broadening meaning has itself affected ancient scholarship. So This is evidenced by Houston Smith, who, in the same article discussed above, credits Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell with introducing entheogens to the contemporary West. It's strange that Smith, a professor of religious studies, would quickly gloss over William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, which Huxley himself cites. And we've seen this in my earlier lectures too, that there's a lot of people that Huxley is drawing on for his own work. So Smith's statement illustrates the popularity of Huxley's thought and to the perception that the discourse changed in the 1950s. And so I think that that's true. So what Huxley, like him or don't like him, but what I'm saying is that there's a lot of people that were working before him and that did that stuff. So he's not the person who just introduced things to people, but it was his popularity in the 1950s that reorients and centralizes Huxley's theories about psychedelics that makes him so influential even still today. So Huxley's work also finds resonance in Ruck's book Apples of Apollo. Huxley's Heaven and Hell from 1956 famously characterized the experience of entheogenic drugs and visionary experiences, both producing mystic ecstasy and horror. This too can be found in the account that Ruck and his colleagues give to Soma in the Apples of Apollo. So along with Perseus, Ruck and his colleagues claim that Prometheus stole Soma in the form of spiritual fire. So how do we get from a juice to fire, right? They also cite Euripides' Aeon, which tells the story of Creusa, the queen of Athens, who receives 2 drops of Medusa's blood, one which was, quote, intended as the consecrating anointment for the city's dynastic sovereign. The other sprang from the Gorgon's serpents and was a lethal poison. In doing so, these scholars both amplify and transcend the romantic tradition of poets like William Blake, within which Huxley had placed his own self in Blake's lineage, right? Like just that reference to heaven and hell is a reference to William Blake. This is also a reference to the Pharmakon, and Jacques Derrida will have lots of theoretical things to say about the Pharmakon and the discourse of the Pharmakon and the poison versus the pleasure of substances. And of course, that's where we get the term pharmacist from today, right? So broadly repetitive associations accompany citation as a method in these scholars. So what do I mean by citation as method? Well, citation is so somebody says something and then everybody else just keeps citing them. Aldous Huxley says something and then everybody keeps citing him. Mircea Eliade says something and everybody just cites him. And then it just becomes commonplace to cite these people without really maybe digging rigorously into the ways that they were thinking and at the time that they were writing. So Ruck and his colleagues build their definition of Soma from the following 3 epithets. So these are Greek epithets, right? Golden apples, an eye, a multiplicity of eyes, golden water, honey, lightning bolts, golden urine, golden semen, golden rain, golden snow, estrual cows, bellowing bulls, golden hides, pelts, phalluses, vulva, wings, etc. So all of those different things they think can relate in some way or in one way or another to Soma. They also suggest that tracing Soma occurs etymologically or through word history, and not just as a collection of epithets. It rains in Greek is the impersonal verb huei, H-U-E-I in English letters. And if there is a subject, they say, this is a quote, it is Zeus. But the verb is cognate with the Sanskrit word sunoti, which means to press out the juice. And so they want to read that's etymological research, right, or philological method. They want to relate the concepts through sacrifice and through what we might call, I don't know if I want to call it theology right now, but at least through the some sort of metaphysics of what Soma is, by tracing word history. And that other scholars might have some real big problems with the assumptions built into that. So we do know that in Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, in Herodotus's accounts of Polycrates' daughter, if you read this, I mean, it's a massive book, but and her premonition of his death, Zeus also brings rain on Polycrates' impaled body. The Vedic Soma is named as the pressed one. So according to Ruck, this concept carries all the way into Christianity with the story of Gethsemane. Of course, the Garden of Gethsemane, right, where Jesus wishes that his dad, if there's any way, that this cup doesn't have to come to me, right? If there's any way that I could avoid being crucified, please, pass it on. But he can't, right? That's this kind of moment where it sinks in that he's going to have to die. So Gethsemane, as they say in Aramaic, means oil press. So they are associating, Ruck and his colleagues are associating the pressing of Soma, which comes from the root su, same root for swine that we get for pigs, with the pressing out of the juice. They're carrying that conceptually all the way into Aramaic and to the word Gethsemane. And they're saying that what happens to Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane is actually an allusion to some sort of psychedelic ritual. So this is a long quote from them. The agony of Gethsemane took place at the oil press, perhaps an element of the mythologizing. For Jesus was prophesied Messiah, or the anointed, as it would now appear, with the same amber feverish pharmacon that Apollonius discovered again amongst the Brahmins or the Brahmanes. This act of pressing is significant since not only does it yield the oil of chrismation, but also the juice of the grape, the wine that will be transubstantiated into the blood of Jesus. The Soma of the Brahmins was named with the epithet the pressed one, pressed in sacrifice from dried mushrooms soaked in water to produce the drink of blood. In the Hellenistic age of religious syncretism, it would have been inevitable that Soma be confused with the Greek word for body. Soma, although its cognates are probably to be found in Greek sus and English swine, the boar being a common metaphor for fly agaric mushrooms, they say the communion experience of the Eucharist was real and profound. So this is a long paragraph that I've just quoted, but this gets at what these scholars are arguing, is that the beginnings of Christianity, and even the ways that we think of the Messiah as the anointed one, that there's something actually psychedelic in the ointment, and that this is carried over through conceptions that go back to ancient India. Now you can believe them or not. I'm tending to err on the side of caution here today, but this is really, it's still very important to think about. So we can also see the sus or swine root in the in this term suovetarilia sacrifice, which is described by Circe to Odysseus in books 10 and 11 of Homer's Odyssey as a sacrifice to Demeter in the underworld, or Persephone, right? So, heady stuff, yeah. Ruck and his colleagues suggest that there's a confusion of meaning between the Greek soma as body and then the juice or the deity in Sanskrit. Rather than confusion, I actually think that it seems to me, if I'm temporarily going to follow their claims here, it seems to me that the term as a cognate, went through a kind of linguistic narrowing between Homer and Christ, and that this narrowing parallels the burgeoning philosophical discussion of the Western state and the Western citizen's relationship to governing bodies. While the narrowed term soma as body may have had a more fixed meaning linguistically, it also had philosophical counterparts in Greek culture that maintained some of it with the contextual aspects of its original meaning, those relating to sacrifice. So that's if I'm going to follow them. And what the goal is for this lecture, just to reassert, is to unpack how these scholars have come up with these conceptions that people sort of refer offhand to without ever having read these scholars before. So the sacrifice ceremony or sacrificial ceremonies differ according to different cultures. So this is where I think there's maybe some room for nuance, more nuance than their kind of universalizing gets at. If sacrificial ceremonies differ according to culture and then get universalized into the kind of structural criticism that scholars like Freud, like what's his name, René Girard, the violence and the sacred, theorists like that. Again, once we're thinking at a kind of structural level, now we've moved away from linguistic analysis, and so is that, what are the problems that we might be taking if we're trying to define an essence of a structure of sacrifice? If sacrificial ceremonies differ across cultures, so are we losing something by saying that sacrifice is this entity that we can see as kind of universalizing, appearing universally across cultures? So there's a political struggle concerning the identity and tension with universalizing or essentializing human experiences beneath these debates. One brief way to see this is to consider ancient Mesopotamian sacrifice in relation to Semitic and Greek notions. So Walter Burckhardt, who's a great, famous Greek scholar, has written extensively concerning a bias and mythological criticism against Oriental or Eastern influence on Greek culture. This is in couple of books, one called The Orientalizing Revolution and Ancient Mystery Cults. And what he was arguing about at the time was he was saying that the too many Eurocentric scholars were denying the fact that there could be an influence from the East in Greek culture. But certain deities, like Dionysus, for example, do seem to come from the East. Tzvi Abush has argued that sacrifice, quote, may serve to maintain a group that is drawn together by or whose identity is based on some common characteristic, but also that a comparison between Semitic sacrifice and Mesopotamian sacrifice reveals an important difference. So for Mesopotamians, for example, according to Abush, sacrifices had to do with the temple, which was a storehouse of food. Food was offered to gods as a part of the relationship where the gods created humans to serve and feed them. After the prepared food was offered to the gods, it was distributed to the members of the cult. The Semites, on the other hand, organized their sacrifices around kinship and blood ties. So for the Semites then, and this is a quotation, for the Semites, it was the family, the tribe, and the wider tribal territory that defined identity and power. This remained true even of the Semites of northern Babylonia and northeastern Syria. For while they absorbed the culture of the urban Mesopotamians of the south, they did not give up their own identities. Rather, they transformed the culture that they had assimilated, introducing new images into it that were consonant with their own background and social situation. Images such as the blood that they introduced into the Mesopotamian mythological tradition of the creation of man. And so what you know, I like this scholar because we see that there's nuance. We see that, yes, the Hebrews, as we know, like, and were put into exile after the fall of the first temple in the 700s BCE, right? Um, uh, and they kind of go away and they're in captivity for a while, and then some of them get to come back to Jerusalem, and they bring a lot of influences from the Babylonians, from the exile, and then we get that kind of period up through the Second Temple period, where all of the kind of biblical scriptures and stuff eventually get written down, and so we are already seeing that there's quite a bit of hybridity going on across various cultures. And I really want I want us to think about nuance, because so many people in psychedelic circles are just like blaze past all of it. And they're just like, oh, everything's just in everything. And the scholar in me wants us to slow down a little bit and be more careful with our research. So, as part of the cultural assimilation, the Semites introduced blood and liquid aspects of sacrifice, which related to kinship relations and the transference of governance by family lineage. So, political theology in its Western sense, it seems to be burgeoning here. These roots of in kind of Old Testament culture or in Hebrew, and eventually Jewish culture, right? So it's Israelites first, right? And they speak Hebrew, and they move from Israelite religion into Judaism over a long period of time. So it is well known that this appears to have replaced the Mesopotamian female-centered fertility social structure. But Marvin W. Myers' book, The Ancient Mysteries, discusses fertility cults surviving in Eleusinian mysteries. So Meyer writes that the Mystae participated in rites that performed three types of sacred observance. The legomena, or the things recited, leg, like lexicon, we get from the same root. The deiknomena, or things shown. Deixis is like, if you say deixis in rhetoric, it's like, I christen this ship, and the words that you're doing as you break the bottle over the bow of the ship, that's a deictic, right? So it's showing as it talks. And dromena, or things performed, and we get drama from that. So once again, legomena, things recited, things shown, and things performed. There are similar distinctions between the different Vedas, just to go with, if we're going to go with Wasson and his colleagues. The Sama Veda, the Rig Veda, and so forth. So in contrast to this, however, Abush discusses the Mesopotamian creation myths, where human bodies were formed out of clay and covered in flesh and blood of a sacrificed god. The god's flesh then gives life to the clay. Quote, the addition of flesh and blood reflects a new point of view in ancient culture, he's saying. While the flesh is the source of the human ghost, the blood is the origin and the ability to plan, that is, of human intelligence, and is ultimately the source and etiology, or the cause, right, of the personal God, or rather the family God, who is passed down from one generation to generation by a male progenitor. The personal God is not simply the God of an isolated individual, rather he is the God of the individual as a social being. The liquid aspects of blood sacrifice here are reminiscent of Vedic Soma. And it would be worthwhile, if it were possible, to more precisely track down the historical diaspora of Aryan and Semitic cultures to see cross-cultural contact. I think that it's worth at least exploring that more. But as I've said, debates over Soma are not settled even today, and that's not likely to end soon. So they are themselves discursively indicative of a Euro-Christian imaginary. We ought to be more skeptical of the motivations driving scholars to re-enchant a secularized citizenship and reorient liberalism, to see that through psychedelics or something like that, we could have an access to this kind of more sacred culture that we have lost. This is very much what big scholars like Mircea Eliade theorized in books like The Sacred and the Profane, right? That modern humanity has become detached, in Max Weber's term, disenchanted. And yet, what these substances can do, psychedelics can somehow put us back in touch with a notion of the sacred that we have lost, and our society is sort of like gone in bad directions because of our disenchantment, is what. So these people are kind of conservative. They're saying, yeah, we need to find the sacred again, is kind of the impulse of scholars like Eliade. What we can perhaps glean, I think, from the discourse that I've presented here is that there's a possibility, at least, that the blood and liquids aspects, which Abush claims are the roots of intelligence, merge with the liquid aspects of the Aryan Soma, and that the liquid and material aspects begin to diverge in Western culture, eventually becoming a distinction between Soma and Psyche, right? And that kind of divide that we're so influenced by in the West, in Western thought. Hebraic political theology shapes Western political theology. The Old Testament is influential, right? Even if it's refracted through Protestantism. Remember that the Protestants saw themselves as like the Hebrews. That's why they called the eastern coast of what's now the United States, they called it their New Jerusalem, right? So they thought that they were coming in and conquering Canaans, which would then be the Native Americans there. In the Yom Kippur festival, and the idea of the scapegoat, one goat was offered to God while the other one bore the sins of the people and was taken out of town by a prepared man and thrown off a cliff. We can see some of this stuff at work too. So Daniel's Johannes Stokel argues, quote, with the destruction of the temple, which would have been the second temple, in 70 CE or current era, the temple ritual lost its natural geography. The center of Jewish worship shifted from the destroyed temple to the synagogues, and its ritual was transformed into a bloodless service of liturgical memory. Hermeneutics replaces then sacrifice. And so this study of Talmud ends up taking the place of ritual sacrifice, and replaces the blood and guts of sacrifice. Actually, that's what you're doing when you're doing hermeneutics, is you're doing that blood and guts work through your reading. Daniel Boyarin, really, really great Judaic studies scholar. Boyarin's work in his book Borderlines, and in his book Intertextuality and the Reading of Midrash, echo such ideas. So while Abush sees a connection between the personal God and blood sacrifice, Stokel sees a decentralization of the sacrifice in Jewish and eventually early Christian cultures. And I point that out because I want to always put that kind of personal relationship into question, because we're so influenced by Protestant Christianity in the United States today. So while it's not possible to trace a direct lineage, I don't think it's possible to trace a direct lineage of the Western meaning of Soma back to an Aryan ritual, some specific knowledge of how Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cultural mixtures helps us to understand how in the West a separation was developing between body and soul. However, that separation, as Abush suggests, develops in relation to an increasingly personalized deity that maintains a unified identity structure through the development of transcendent religion. So what I'm basically talking about is that this is kind of like how Jesus is showing up, and the focus on Jesus's body is showing up, and how that does have to come out of this earlier Judaic context that had shifted from a polytheistic situation where you had Baal and El and Yahweh, to the Yahwist cult, which actually wins out, right? Sometimes what we call in biblical studies the Deuteronomist historian, right, is the one who redacts all of the various myths, and so we get a heavy Yahwist influence in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch, for Jewish folks. So Boyarin's work, this is very fascinating stuff to me. Boyarin's work, again, comes to mind, but also Leora Batnitsky's really great book, How Judaism Became a Religion, comes to mind here. Also Marcel Gaucher, who has aligned transcendence with the idea of the state, like the state with a capital S, an ancient axial culture, he calls it. Jacques Derrida has identified this with the pharmacon and the force of law, and right-wingers like Alain de Benoist, like far-right right-wingers. This is a guy who was influential on the far-right movement in France today, with the benefits of empire. So the people who in the far-right communities who are saying what we need is something like an empire again, their political theology is tied up in some of this stuff, and that's why I think it's really important once we really start digging in to some of these strains of thought that may not at first seem like that's what's going on with psychedelics, but of course, because psychedelics are illegal, have been made illegal, there's always an interaction between drugs and the state. Drugs and the state. Who gets to do it? Who gets to define what it is? Who gets to say whether it's restricted or not? So theory of state, or political theory, or political theology, are really useful modes of discourse to have around us as we're studying psychedelics, especially if you're like me and into discourse analysis. So it's also a mess, right? So such is the political vortex that psychedelic aesthetics in general will signal. Like, so when we just think about psychedelic aesthetics and all of the fuzziness around them and the bright colors and the mixing and the blending of one thing into the next, I think that the discourse does that too. And so now we're talking about state theory, and now we're talking about drugs, and now we're talking about music, and now we're talking about pictures, now we're talking about religion, all of that stuff. So within Western culture, Soma must be seen with in its Greek counterpart, though, which is psyche, right? And those of us who are grew up in the West, I think this is probably pretty clear that we have a dualistic, whether it's good or bad that we have had that in our notions of the body, as opposed to Chinese medicine or traditional Chinese medicine. They have a different conception of how the body works, right? But in the West, psyche has been separated from soma, and so the traditional concept can be traced pretty easily historically now. This is a quotation. So the soma, which is contrasted with psyche in Western culture, right? We're not talking about soma in the Rig Veda right now. The soma is contrasted with psyche. It's seen variously as the shell of a real person, a kind of counter self with desires and goals of its own, the sensible or the affective part of ourselves, the unactualized potentiality of a living being. I can build muscles or something. The nature of the organism which carries out the operations of life, the community of Christian believers, and a mechanical automaton, a mechanism which is in the state of constant corruption. And you're starting to get what will become in Neoplatonic thought and thinkers like Christian thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, this kind of corruption of the body, right? The corruption of flesh. So while Ruck, to go back to him and his colleagues here, while Ruck and his colleagues connect Soma to the Gethsemane of the Eucharist, Wright and Potter trace it to Christian conceptions of corrupted flesh. This is an inversion of the Mesopotamian idea that the fleshy parts of the sacrifice god gave clay men to life. So, as the word soma changed meaning from Sanskrit to Greek, entering a Western discourse based on tensions between mind and body, its meaning then narrowed to signify something seemingly even more materialistic. In Greek discourse, the tension arises between soma, the body, and psyche, or breath, life, or soul. As a result, psyche takes on some abstract liquid and vaporous qualities of soma. Psyche, like soma, then, means a variety of things for us in Western culture. So this is a long quote from Wright and Potter. Again, psyche means the life principle of the body, the principle of sensation, the purposeful movement, the morally significant part of the human being, the principle of a being which has self-movement, the intellectual part of the self, the form of the natural body, possessing a potentiality of life, the inner person who can reflect on himself, an intellectual being constantly required for the maintenance of the body, a force that represents the teleological and integrative processes of the living organism. Beat, or Beate, I'm not sure how to say their name right, Gundert, discusses how the usage of the word psyche changes throughout the Hippocratic corpus, like Hippocratic medicine in the West, saying, among other things, that psyche, quote, refers to the male and female seed as the vehicle of life. It does then retain some material qualities. And so for the Hippocratic physician, mind and body are two distinct yet related aspects of human nature. According to the regimen, both soma and psyche consist of the same substances. The characteristics of both are shaped in a similar fashion by external influences and inheritance. The division is not absolute. Symptoms change from mental to somatic, and vice versa, as a disease moves from one part of the body to another. This concept had changed then, by the time we get to like Hippocratic Oath and since Homer. And here again, there's a division between body and soul that gets thematic. For Homer, psyche is the life principle that leaves the body, soma, after death and persists in images in Hades. Between Homer and Plato, psyche, while originally meaning life, albeit now the living person, comes through a fusion with the many specific expressions for perception, thought, and the emotions to denote, in addition, the mental correlate to soma. The pair psyche and soma stands for the living person in its totality in the West. In Homer, soma designates a body or a corpse for the Greeks, losing its liquid qualities and becoming a static and taking on the physical aspects of sacrifice. It is thus a body that is sacrificed for the Greeks. We see this with the pharmakon and human sacrifice. Soma in Western culture, therefore, thereafter takes on a more nominative, or the subject case in grammar, nouns, names, a more nominative or accusative. So it's subject or object, fixed linguistic meaning. This is part of what we would call Western culture with our dualities. And the linguistic interchange between subjectivity and objectivity as it relates to mysticism. Its relationship to psychedelic aesthetics should be sought here, but also its relationship to mysticism, which of course is this class, mysticism and psychedelics, and contrasts the development of the concept of psyche, while never completely separate from soma, often relates in Western culture to that capacity for feeling, for sense, and for perception, for intelligence, all of that. So I'm going to stop there today. I know that I've taken you on a lot of trips, and no pun intended with the trip thing, but I've really wanted us to think about, how detailed scholarship can be around some of this stuff, and why I might hold at arm's length people's kind of grand theorizing about the ability to like take a psychedelic and just, somehow transcend all of, the past 3,000 plus years and go to some sort of archaic state. Don't have to believe me or don't have to agree with me, but that's where I'm gonna stay today. Thanks for attending, and I'll pick up with you on the next lecture.